The Witnesses by William Sansom. We, the witnesses, were of course present throughout the episode, although it would be difficult ever to determine whether what we saw was the final truth or indeed if we viewed the matter in its right perspective at all. For at the time there was a great deal of smoke blurring the air, and certain other factors might have confused us too. Imagine a patch of marshland in the mist. The blackish earth smokes out its white vapor. There are little mounds where the mist appears to gather in greater density. There are pockets and sloping hollows that sometimes emerge clearly, providing suddenly an ephemeral vista of some few yards, and then, as quickly, disappear as the white wet fog seeps and drifts all about them. Sometimes the fog hangs immobile like a terrible pale blindness, and sometimes it wreathes and eddies. Then it has the motion of some slow-moving monster, a caterpillar, waving its head vaguely in search of food. It will so inevitably, so casually swallow. But in this case the marsh had no surface of black peat. It is a wasteland of bad-smelling coffee beans. Coffee beans have poured from their burst sacks and now lie silted in the thick mounds for hundreds of feet around. They have been burning, for there has been a fire, and the warehouse that once enclosed them has collapsed many hours ago, so that a few bricks and strange promontories of broken masonry emerge at intervals from the brown swamp of steaming beans. Firemen have quenched the first fury of the fire. But there are still moments of danger ahead, for within the brownish-purple mounds and dunes there still lie muffled nests of fire, deep and unpredictable, smoldering fiercely, corroding upwards as their hidden heat germinates, multiplying themselves in their effort to erupt a combustive exit. Upon these dangerous mounds firemen still pour a ceaseless stream of water. As the water drenches down, a mist of steam rises and, mixing with the smoke, fogs the air thickly. Above this swamp a fireman seems to float in mid-mist. If you had stood below and looked up, you would have thought he was actually riding the steam, really straddling with the grip of his oil-skinned knees the white cloud itself. But this is the illusion of steam and smoke, for he really sits astride a broken wall obscured by the white veil of mist. As the mist drifts, you see a part of the wall. It is some 20 feet high, so that the fireman sits in a precarious seat. He directs the jet from his hose downwards into the beans, or onto the beans, circling here and there as the smoke guides him toward patches of internal fire. The hose is heavy, the water pressure as much as he can hold, so that if something were to slip, the fireman would certainly be thrown off the wall and down into the terrible boiling beans, where he might break his head against some angular rock of masonry. Thus he is careful to keep the ridge of wall well gripped between his legs. We watched those thick-booted legs of his as he leaned forward. We knew well that he forced his body forward because the hose and its live recoil constantly dragged him back. He leaned forward in a sense, resting on the firm hose. Yet while he rested, he had to push as well, for his weight alone could not control that pressure. The insides of his knees were aching as they bruised themselves slowly against the hard brick. Although he was scarcely able to move the position of his body on that constricted wall, occasionally he had to ease his pressed flesh and tired muscles, for the strain of 2 or 3 hours in such a cramped position is tremendous. It calls for no quick exertion, no leap of prowess, but it is like carrying a heavy trunk. When your muscles accumulate their torture, and with the strain of each added minute, when hard corners bite into your flesh, when out of breath you drop the trunk heavily on a landing, determined to stretch and rest your cramped body before continuing up the next flight of stairs. But high up on the wall you cannot rest. The fireman must bear the torture of his trunk for hours, not minutes. If he relaxes even for a second, and the hose if he relaxes even for a second, the hose will likely whip out of his hands and sweep him off the wall with a single quick twist of its violent water pressure. So the fireman eases his seat, only slightly, grits his teeth, and presses. Thus, on this occasion, that particular fireman sat high up in the steam and watched his feathering jet of water soak into the brown mess beneath. Water trickled over his hands from a leaky joint in the brass nozzle. The water was ice cold. His hands were blue and burning with cold. Once he looked down to a patch of clear pavement just beneath the wall where the pump that served him was at work. The pump operator was bending over the controls. The fireman called down to him. It was some sort of greeting that he called, but the operator never looked up, not feeling so sociable, thought the fireman, or is he still grumbling at me over... The fireman thought of a row they had earlier that afternoon. The soaked mash of beans smelt thickly of something like wet sacking. It was a dead smell. It seemed to clog the air. The fireman screwed up his nostrils in disgust. He coughed as a thicker drift of smoke whipped his lungs. Then, painfully, he eased his seat on the hard brick. "This is most comfortable," he grunted, "isn't it?" He shifted the beam of water over to a streak of smoke that showed blue against the whitish steam. He settled down to wait again, and, with only the automatic tank in his hands, his mind began to dream. He thought suddenly, here I am, high up on the wall, riding above everybody, like a rich man in his car. How fine it is to lie back on the cushions and look through the warm, solid glass at the cold world that hurries along the street outside. I am shaved and my fingers are clean. I am free from the sweat of walking and the grime of bus rails. I can lie back and think at my leisure. None of the minor mechanics of movement to disturb me. I am transported. Why, I can even continue to construct the affairs of business that have brought me this freedom from interruption, so that as I lie back, I am at the same time insuring myself against all interruptions and irritations of the future. The position is perpetual and unassailable." The hose stiffened slightly. The pump operator must have increased the water pressure. Then it slackened to its previous strength. Tricky, thought the fireman. He'll throw me off the wall if he does that too much. His thoughts returned to the limousine. But, distracted from their original plane, they began to consider the rich man more detachedly. Of course, thought the fireman, you can't blame them for wanting to keep away from the bustle. They've got to keep their minds clear in that sort of job. The more leisure for consideration, the greater their efficiency. Yet perhaps, if they took their part in the scramble for the tube and in the bus queue in the rain, well, they'd get to know their fellow men better. What they think is sacrificed in efficiency might be